please, Auntie Margaret, come up, please, and make her welcome.
Thank you. Reconciliation Week is a national event. It's all well and good for the general population to wish to reconcile with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population in relation to, wrongs, mistakes, misjudgments, and the other things that have occurred here in Australia since settlement. We can work together towards that reconciliation, but I think something that you could all really give some serious thought to is whether or not you would consider entering into a treaty arrangement with those First Peoples. Now, it's not hard. It's not about taking or claiming anything that you can call your personal property. It's about giving us back the rights to our ancestral lands and our important places and our important objects, of which there are many. Right now the Wurundjeri Council is, and I forgot to bring some flyers, but I did arrange through Jeffrey to have some up there, which I haven't seen, Jeffrey. There's a barrack painting going on sale in Sydney next week. So we've been scurrying around in the last few days trying to find money to purchase it. Now, that object, piece of art, is very important to the Wurundjeri people, the Woiwurrung speaking peoples, because of Barrack's status as our leader back in the 1800s when Corrandirk was established, and his ability and his wisdom in ensuring that we as a people survived here, so that we can join in with you in conversations such as this being held tonight, which is just the beginning, and be able to stand tall and proud and say, yes, this is our land. Yes, we've been happy to share it with you all, and we're happy to continue that in a relationship that is beneficial to both of us. Now, that's where Wurundjeri people are heading. So we've been scurrying around trying to get that money. I'm really not asking you for donations, but if you've got a spare few $100 laying around, it would be helpful. We'll accept it gratefully. You might even find that because we have all kinds of tax breaks and things, you might even get a tax break from the tax office yourself. So there is a document flying around in the ethereal world up there that does ask for donations, so just have a look, barrack painting contributions, it'll come up somewhere out there in the iCloud or whatever the heck you call it, and I'd be most grateful if you could contribute. That's no pressure on you. So the reason I'm here is to welcome you to country and sit on this panel. I am a treaty sovereignty supporter, have been probably since I first got involved in Aboriginal affairs back in the late 70s. That was through the Dandenong Aborigines Cooperative. My first job out of school, and my passion and my forethought and trying to just be of assistance to my people, which was any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person at that point in time out in our local community. I've been a very strong supporter of local community controlled organisations, but I can't quite come at those organisations taking away the authority of traditional owners. Everybody who is Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, whether they're stolen generation or living here from interstate, is a traditional owner. And for those people, it's just somewhere else, not here. So the Wurundjeri people, along with other traditional owner groups around the state, I'm very sure would wish to start determining their own business. And that's not necessarily about the social welfare type service delivery that the organisations have as their responsibility and their mandate. Ours is looking after country, preserving our traditions, preserving our family history, preserving the important places and the objects. And that cannot be taken away from us, and it cannot be delivered or managed by anyone else. So that's pretty well where I stand, along with, I've dropped a letter to the Lord Mayor, which I'm going to deliver to Susan here in a moment. That's why she's waiting. That is actually quite important. The Wurundjeri Council in very recent times has proposed to the Moreland City Council that we join together and start having treaty discussions on hopefully coming up with a document at the end of that process that will help us both as peoples move forward together and have an arrangement that is there, in perpetuity, that can be reviewed from time to time. So it actually is my pleasure to deliver this, which is also a suggestion to the City of Melbourne, with whom we've had a very long relationship. We've, been delivering activities and cultural events for Moomba over many years, and we just want to strengthen that and do more, besides sending people such as me to welcome you to country. So I'll just quickly read this out because I do have 6 minutes and I want to make the most of it. So no doubt you're all aware that the state of Victoria has initiated a treaty and self-determination dialogue with the First Nation people of Victoria. The Honourable Minister for Local Government and Aboriginal Victoria held a statewide forum last week on the 3rd of, back in February and last week in Melbourne, and those events were streamed to 10 locations around Victoria. Participants in the discussions numbered around 500. A very strong decision was made at those forums to commence a dialogue on treaty as the highest priority. Further regional forums will be organised throughout the state and have been held to continue that dialogue and authorise a First Nations negotiation team. Now, those meetings were held in April and May in Mildura, Horsham and Bairnsdale. Now, there's been 2 forums, first one a one-dayer, and then last week's was over 2 days here in Melbourne. And the Wurundjeri Committee of Management met last Wednesday, and subject to further discussions with the City of Melbourne, wish to seek to scope a treaty dialogue with the City of Melbourne. The Wurundjeri peoples, together with other First Nations, would be pleased to scope that and support treaty negotiations as a first for Australia. A treaty at local government level would be unique and reflect the best treaties around the world, and we look forward to a continuing dialogue. Now I'll just hand this to Susan. Somebody take a photograph quickly. As proof, I know she's very busy, but she's not allowed to forget to deliver it. There you go.
I will deliver it.
That's all right.
Here's the photo.
Okay. Yes.
It's in safe hands.
Yes, thank you. I will hold you to that. Now, you'll see over here there's a poster of all the people that have received honours on the Victorian Aboriginal Honour Roll. The importance of the majority of those people is that they were here back in the old days when there was nothing, absolutely nothing for Aboriginal people in this state, and particularly not in Melbourne, in any of the suburbs or here in the central Melbourne. Now, those people, I'm sure, are looking down on us now and giving us ideas while we're asleep and hoping that everybody can support the idea of treaty and sovereignty and give us the lift up that we need to have, not just amongst ourselves, but from the general population. I think that's why we're all here tonight, to talk with you about that, and please have some good questions if you can later on. Don't be afraid, no questions, silly. And those people were formative in the beginning of the commencement of good service delivery and a lifting of identity, a lifting of pride, and a lifting of living standards for Aboriginal people across this state. And, as it turns out, in some cases, nationally. Now, the importance of what we're entering into from today is to honour them, not just by giving them an award, because many of them aren't with us anymore, and not to just honour them while they're still alive, but to do something with the legacy they left us to continue and move forward. Waminjika Yir and Kundi Bik Wurundjeri Balak, welcome to the land of the Wurundjeri people, who are part of the Kulin Nation, but this is Wurundjeri country, and we look forward to your support from today onwards. Thank you.
So much for the preliminaries. Let me now introduce the panel probably in the order in which they'll be speaking. Margaret, you've met already, but can I formally introduce Auntie Margaret Gardner, a Wurundjeri elder and a traditional custodian, and call her to the podium? Thanks, Margaret. Shireen Morris is a Senior Policy Advisor and Constitutional Reform Research Fellow at the Cape York Institute, also doing a PhD at Monash University and co-editor of tonight's the book that's just been launched here tonight and is for sale up there. Shireen? Gary Murray comes from the Victorian Traditional Owner Land Justice Group and is a First Nation clansman from the Alps, Murray River and the Wimmera. Larry Walsh is a Tangarang elder and a local Aboriginal cultural leader and storyteller. And Dr. Gary Foley is a Professor of History at Victoria University. Now, it's a wonderful audience that we have here tonight, and it's not surprising because this is a very critical time for the issues that are raised by tonight's conversation: recognition, treaty, sovereignty, and self-determination. There's been a lot of talk about all of these issues over a very long period of time, but we live in a moment, I hesitate to say, this is a very exciting time. We live in a moment when these issues are actively on the public stage for debate and hopefully decision. You've already heard about some of the things that are going on. Margaret Gardner referred in her remarks to the treaty process in Victoria, a most exciting development which is also having flow-on effects elsewhere in the country, and which is now, as she's told you, also beginning to involve treaty discussions at the local government level, which is also another significant development. In addition, at the national level, there's been a debate on constitutional recognition, as you will be aware. There is a referendum council, and that referendum council will shortly be hosting Indigenous meetings around the country, and also non-Indigenous meetings in the fullness of time. Both of those issues are very actively in play at the moment, and tonight is an opportunity to hear a little bit about what's going on in relation to each of them, whether they will overlap at some point and in what form is something that remains to be seen, but perhaps that's something that we can also explore. So tonight is an opportunity to pursue those questions, those matters, to ask questions of our very well-informed panellists, and generally to push the debate along in as informed a manner as possible. The format for this evening is that I'll invite each of our panellists to speak for 5 to 6 minutes, telling you whatever they want to tell you about these various issues. I'll then give them an opportunity to ask each other questions and to have a bit of a discussion amongst themselves. And then I will throw it open to questions from the audience, and I ask you if you wish at least, to stand up and introduce yourself as you're asking the question. So can I begin by asking Auntie Margaret if she'd like to take the stage?
Will I stand?
Or you
I'll
can- or you
sit,
can
stand,
where
or
you are if you
I
like.
might sit.
We're
Thank
all
you.
mic'd up.
Thank
so-
you. Well, I suppose I could elaborate a bit more on the aspirations of the Wurundjeri people. As I stated earlier, we do have arrangements with, for instance, the City of Melbourne to conduct cultural type activities, particularly in the parade for Moomba each year. We've just recently secured, for example, providing cultural activity within AFL events for all major games. We've just recently all experienced, and if you're Barrack for Essendon and Richmond, you'd be aware that there was a very big event just held this past Saturday. Now, they're the types of things that all Aboriginal traditional owners would like to have the opportunity to participate in, to show off what they have as traditions and customs and entertainment, and even when it comes down to our young children with their sporting ability. Now, a treaty arrangement for the Wurundjeri people, particularly with local government and then the state, would probably cover slightly different things. And with each local government area, as a for instance, it might also cover slightly different things, because in those different areas we have different important places. You know, the City of Shire of Yarra Ranges, we would naturally want to discuss things in relation to the former Corranderk Aboriginal Reserve. We'd want to discuss things such as the Corranderk Aboriginal Cemetery at Hillsville, which formed part of the original Corranderk, that of course is on separate title. Within the City of Moreland, for instance, there's a future relationship coming between the Wurundjeri people and other First Nation people who live within the municipality, which hasn't ever been formally done before. Now, I have to say that the City of Melbourne were the first ones who, amongst themselves at a council meeting, resolved that they would like to enter into treaty discussions with the traditional owners of the Wurundjeri people. An excellent first step. They are the first in this state that I'm aware of. Anyway, if I'm wrong, please tell me. So it's important for that momentum to be maintained. So first off, City of Moreland, we would be very interested in securing and providing not just cultural heritage type activities out of the old Glenroy High School, which became the Aboriginal Code School, the only one in Melbourne, at Glenroy. We would also be looking at that as being a hub for the local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community, as well as the residents. Now that in itself would be a win-win-win for that local government area. There are no services out there for Aboriginal people, slightly more maybe, for local residents, and we're starting to look at ways of combining those interested parties in a real way in making life better for everyone. Now, I suppose if we can't lead the way in that, I suppose there's something wrong. We should be leading the way in things being a bit more green and environmentally friendly and things like that. Now, my vision of what would go into a treaty would be some things that I'm sure people will want to discuss in great depth. Some people might feel threatened by it, but people should think practically and think about the ways in which they can assist us alternatively in ensuring that we can run our own businesses. We can really have our own self-determination that isn't reliant on government funding, because we don't want to, forever and a day, be reliant on the government to not just survive as local community controlled organisations or traditional owner groups or legal entities. We want to be able to get out there and compete with all of you in the real world, not just be the government funded bodies that we've always been and really had no hope of ever getting out of. So they're the things generally that I think we can start to promote amongst our own community out there. Now, as far as leading that, I think traditional owners need to do that because they're the ones responsible for the preservation and maintenance of the land. Not just the people within it, but the land itself. And we're the ones that have more authority and rights and interests over that land than someone from interstate. Now, that's not to say we're better, it just happens we're still here. We're living on our country and we want to have more of a say about it, and we have to be allowed to have that. That's like saying, yes, you can buy your property, yes, you pay your rates, but you don't have any say over it. So it's the same thing for us, except for most of us, we don't really own anything. Certainly not freehold, anyway. All title at the moment that's given or allowed to be acquired by Aboriginal people has conditions on it. We're never able to sell it. The only places we've actually managed to get are the important places that, you know, come on, we wouldn't sell anyway, like Corrindurk, like the Corrindurk Aboriginal Cemetery. But how can we sell off bits and pieces of that? They're things that you don't do. So there are things that probably need to be relaxed a bit more, but there are things that we will definitely want to go after that we need the understanding and support of everyone to realise. And they're the things that we're going to enter into with fervour, and we're going to come up with some brilliant ideas, I think, and I'll hand over now to the rest of the panel because they want to have a say too.
Thanks, Margaret. Thanks, Margaret. That was a great start. Shireen.
I want to just say a couple of the things you said, Auntie Margaret, I think are so along the lines of the work we've been doing at Cape York Institute. So I've been working on constitutional recognition and reform for the last 5 years, and it's just dawning on me in a really big way in the last week how aligned some of our thinking is across the continent. And I think the great thing about these Victorian treaty discussions, and I thank Dr. Foley for inviting me to observe some of those, is that we're so much talking about the same things over the past couple of years, and I think that is really exciting. So 3 things that stood out for me that you said were practicality, self-determination, and having more of a say about the things that happen on your land as Indigenous people. So when I think about treaty or constitutional reform, I think about pretty much trying to address similar kinds of problems and exploring similar kinds of themes. So whether you're talking about constitutional reform or treaties, those kinds of things are structural reforms. And what they aim at doing is making the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Australian state fairer than it has been in the past, putting in place structures and reforms to ensure greater self-determination and a greater say for Indigenous people over their affairs. And so I find it interesting that when you look around the world at similar colonised nations, Canada, the USA, New Zealand, there are basically 4 ways that those nations make their relationships with their Indigenous peoples fairer. So the first one is through bills of rights and rights clauses. And we don't have a Bill of Rights in Australia. Most other Western nations have rights clauses which to some extent protect minority rights. The second way is through representative arrangements, like through representative bodies and reserved seats. New Zealand's got reserved Maori seats so that Maori people can have a voice in Parliament. But they also have the Maori Council that is a representative and advocacy body. Then the third way is through treaties and agreements. And each of those three countries has them. Australia doesn't. And we also don't have representative arrangements, by the way. And the fourth way is through measures for cultural and language recognition that Aunty Margaret also mentioned right at the start. You know, the Maori people have Maori recognised as an official language in their constitution. And the thing that I found so incredible when I observed these 2 days of treaty discussions is that what are they talking about? You know, they're talking about an Indigenous representative body at the national or the state level. Indigenous barrister Tony McAvoy talked about an Assembly of First Nations, and at the state level as well. Mark McMillan, Indigenous constitutional scholar, talked about, you know, this is getting practical about sovereignty. He said, how do First Nations want to represent their sovereignty, you know? And what type of representative structures do they want to use? Such a practical question. And I think once we start getting into the practical nitty-gritty of what we are talking about in this treaty and what we are talking about in constitutional reform, you see that we're actually talking about the same stuff. And that, to me, is very interesting, because what has been painted is a dichotomy. It's one or the other. Constitutional recognition's about symbolism, treaties about practical reform, you know, and I think that is a really serious misconception. And I just want to say this, I think it is a divide and conquer type misconception. It is about the labels, it's not about the practical content. Because at this time last year, we at Cape York Institute were presenting to the Native Title Conference up in Port Douglas, and guess what we were talking about? We were talking about the need for a representative body at the national level, a First Nations representative body at the national level, but we argue it should be underpinned in the Constitution so that it can never be struck down like ATSIC was. We just put in a submission to the Human Rights Act inquiry in Queensland asking for a representative body at the state level. We're also arguing for an Australian Settlements Commission to oversee national agreement making. And this is an idea that came up at the treaty talks in Victoria, at Truth and Reconciliation Treaty Commission. And of course, we were talking about language and cultural recognition too. So I think that is something that has really dawned on me this week, in the last week. And the final thing I'll just say about sovereignty, I think it is really helpful when we're thinking about sovereignty, because it can be quite an amorphous symbolic concept in a lot of ways. As Mark McMillan said, what does it mean? And you know, the idea that Indigenous sovereignty was not ceded when Australia was colonised, I agree with. But I think in a practical sense, what's happened, and I'm a constitutional scholar, so I like thinking about the Constitution. I think that the imposed constitutional and institutional structure imported from Britain is, if you can imagine, it's squashing down that surviving Indigenous sovereignty. It's not letting it thrive and flourish. When we talk about self-determination, constitutional recognition, treaty and all these things, and we talk about creating an Indigenous representative body in the Constitution, what we're really talking about is creating some space in that imposed constitutional structure to allow some of that Indigenous sovereignty to shine through. And I think that's what treaty and constitutional recognition seeks to do. It seeks to set in place practical measures to let some of that surviving Indigenous sovereignty shine through in a practical way.
Thanks, Shireen. Now can I call on our third panellist, Gary Murray?
It's been one hell of a 2 weeks. We did do that 2-day treaty forum last week, and we did the Sir Doug Nicholls AFL round, my grandfather, and that was pretty exciting too. if we reflect on who we are, we're 40 First Nations in Victoria, 260 across Australia. You can call them First Nations or language groups, but that's what existed before Cook 228 years ago. Now I'm going to focus on Victoria because that's where the action is. I don't want to tinker with a white man's constitution that doesn't even look after white women, let alone black people. 228 years of dispossession, deculturalisation and dispersal around this state. We're put on missions and stations and reserves, shot, murdered, genocided, our language taken from us. Victoria has suffered probably the worst impacts along with Tasmania. Today, those 30, 40 First Nations language groups, they're still there. Not the way they were, but they're still there. And as those 40 First Nations who will do a treaty. And those 40 First Nations comprise 200 clans. And when I say a clan, I say, for example, my ancestor, Bardup Gunditj Rob Roy Stewart, with his white name, came from Gumjunjuk clan at Lake Boga. He was born about 1830, 1840, died 1940. He had a mail contract for 50 years at Lake Boga, probably the longest serving Aboriginal public servant in Australia. Never got a stamp though. And there was a story about him. He used to take the horses and the letters across the river, floods, summer, and he never lost a letter in 50 years, but he drowned 3 horses. That's the sacrifice our people make. Drown your horses. Good story. But I suppose my point is, today there's 50,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people living in Victoria. And whilst there's probably 30,000 First Nations people from Victoria, there's probably about 15,000, 20,000 from other states. Any treaty has to take everybody on board. And we would be looking at doing treaties amongst ourselves, as well as Torres Strait Islanders. There's 6,000 Torres Strait Islanders live in Victoria. What are we going to do with that lot? They're not going to go home. They're not going to get any rights from native title or some constitutional change. So we have to look after them too, because we're compassionate people. We share stuff. So, treaty is a long time coming. And the one thing we've all got in common is the baggage from the past. It's not just a monopoly that we've got on the baggage. You've also got the baggage. You've got an inheritance from your grandparents, from your great-grandparents, same as I have, about what's happened in this country. And what's happened in this country is well documented. You know the good, the bad and the ugly. You know the racism. You look at us and you look at Arnhem Land. You don't see the same. That's the impact over 7 generations. I'm not up here talking my language, I'm talking the Queen's English. When I went to high school at Glenroy, I did 4 years of French. Je parlez-vous français? I still remember it. Not all of it. So, lots of impacts. So here we are in 2016. You know, treaties aren't no big deal. They're just an agreement. States, nations make treaties all the time. Australia's probably got over 1,000 treaties. Globally, ain't no big deal. It's just an agreement. And it's an agreement to address the past and the present and the future. That's all it is. So don't fear it. It's not like all the fear-mongering that was around when Mabo came out. Absolutely disgraceful stuff that was. We've obviously suffered a lot. And one of the biggest things that have happened to us is our dispossession 40 nations were across 27 million acres. We're now down to about 20,000 acres out of 27 million. Now, you all know, you got land, you got an economic base. We haven't. Most of those bits of land come from missions from the old days. There's hardly any economic project that stands alone on its own feet that's viable. Where do you see us in the CBD? Do you see a building that's uniquely ours, that we own, that we manage, that you see where we showcase our cultural heritage? You don't see it. But there is a plan, probably in the treaty. The treaty needs a house. And it's got to have a building in the CBD that's linked to the First Nations out there, whether they're in Bright, whether they're in Horsham, Mildura, all those groups out there are scoping cultural facilities that could be linked to the one here. A treaty, well, we can talk about the Constitution, and God bless it. God bless it. And we need to address it. If there's a racist clause in there, get rid of it. Get rid of it. But us black people, we really haven't got a say in it. There's 14 million voters out there, and it ain't us. So you know what to do, eh? You know what to do, don't you? Get rid of the racist clauses. Common sense. And make sure there's a Bill of Rights out there somewhere. Make sure that we look after everybody. And I welcome all the refugees here too while I'm at it. Have I used up Shireen or Margaret's time yet? Yeah. Am I into my time?
Unfortunately, you have.
Right. I think there's a lot of issues about a treaty. It's going to take time, and it's got to be clan-based. It means that fellow at Lake Barger's got a clan, and whether he's Lake Barger or Gunai Kurnai or whatever group, it's got to be clan-based. It's got to be family groups that sign off on any treaty after the negotiations really get down to the ticky-tacks. Organisations don't own a treaty. It is a clan that owns that treaty because they've got the rights, they've got the territory, they've got the tradition and customary law, they've got the cultural heritage, the art and the craft and everything else that goes with it. There was a move last week that organisations wanted a seat at the table. They got 2 seats. But that might not be right. That might get changed. A treaty must not be symbolic. It's not just a handshake and a bloody cup of tea. It's got to be practical, isn't it? One thing about treaties that, if you enact it in legislation, or even if you put it in the Constitution, it can be changed. They can do a referendum on a constitutional thing and change it, just like they're trying to do now. So the treaty's got to have a jurisdiction that protects it. If it's enacted by a state parliament, next government might change it. So we say this, if we're going to have a treaty, we want really stiff penalties in there for a breach. So if somebody comes in and tries to change it for bad reasons, to our detriment, then the penalties would be enforced. So maybe we're looking at a contractual arrangement that's legally binding on all the parties and that we agree to the jurisdiction. And I don't know about the jurisdiction thing too much, but the state jurisdiction is Commonwealth jurisdiction, is international stuff. We might need to look overseas for that. How much more time? It's interesting that the City of Moreland and also now the City of Melbourne have been approached to do a treaty. We welcome local government to do that. It's really important they do it. And the sort of things that go in a treaty are just as important. We've got to talk about sovereignty, might take a while, but we can talk about land rights legislation right now and it can be enacted next year. We're not going to let the state government of Victoria lead us down a path where nothing happens in 4 years. As an act of good faith, they should enact land rights legislation as soon as possible. If they do it, we know their fair dinkum, mate. So, to wind up, my grandfather, Pastor Doug Nichols, used to say, you can play a note on the white notes of a piano, and you can play a note on the black notes of the piano. But to get harmony, you've got to play both, and that's where you guys come in. Thank you very much.
We sign a treaty right now, I'll still have 2,000 to 3,000 homeless Aboriginal people. We sign a treaty right now, we're still going to have the health problems we've got. We sign a treaty right now, we have problems with the education system. My support of a treaty is good. The speakers are good. I acknowledge in the audience Rob Thorpe, who has spoken to me many years on this subject and helped shape some of my views. Thank you, Rob. But infrastructure. If I had self-determination tomorrow, I can't think of one mechanic. I can't think of one plumber. I can't think of one electrician. I can think of 2 carpenters. I can think of 30 gardeners, because I'm one of the founders of Indigenous gardening and landscaping, so I can think of it. Yeah, a lot of people see me as a bit of a lair, and I suppose I deserve that because I deliberately do that. It's my way of judging people. However, right now should be the time to start focusing on those things we need whilst we keep these treaty discussions going, while we keep the sovereignty discussions going. I want a change in the Aboriginal education policy. I'm sick of following your white bureaucrats' idea of going to university. It leaves us no infrastructure workers. I think we have some very bright young people and some bright people who have been through university who have got us to where we are now, but we have to go backwards before we can move forward. We need infrastructure. We need carpenters, electricians, plumbers. Don't worry, if I have to, take over every empty government house in Melbourne to house the homeless Aboriginal. If it gets me into trouble, I'm happy with that. It'll make it an issue. I follow my history a bit. In my history, from what I understand, we never had a homeless problem. Everyone was housed. We never had a health problem. Even Gary talked about how old did your ancestor live to? Nearly 80? 96. Our health was a lot better then than now. Our education fitted what we needed and what we wanted and what helped us to survive in our environment. We have not got them anymore. You keep on wanting to give policies that are good for yous. We are Australia in 1780. The need for tradespeople, the need for people who can build our structures, who can look after our structures. If we had the money tomorrow, it'd be all going back to yous because we haven't got the people in our communities who we can hire to do those jobs so that that money stays within and feeds members of our communities. For me, we definitely need a treaty. We definitely need recognition of sovereignty. But it's the steps on the way that are my concern. Plus, we have taken a leap of faith in the government. I don't think the government's taken the same leap of faith as we have. Because I get this feeling I'm being conned. I get this feeling they've already picked out who they want on this treaty negotiation. How do I pick that? I don't know. Perhaps because every time I hear people speak, I listen for key words. And now and then, I heard those key words. This is supposed to be an open and transparent. It's not, as far as I see it. I don't know why, just say a gut feeling, and as my uncle used to say, rely on gut feelings, usually they're right. We have the chance. I need more transparency from government. That I don't think we're getting. As I said, I feel they've already appointed the committee without that consultation. I feel we need to stop the government in its tracks and say, right, if we talk self-determination, if we talk sovereignty, we need to now have some people focus on our infrastructure needs. I'm quite happy to let people talk treaty. All I know is from every treaty I've ever looked at, and I only got the second form, so some of the language is very hard on me, but I understand there are at least 6 principles that seem to go across every treaty, and someone could correct me if I'm right or wrong on that. There may be a few more. But those principles are the starting point. The first is recognising that we are sovereign people. The second is recognising that we have a culture, a language, distinct cultures that are ours. I can't remember them all off the top of my head because I only do things off the top of my head. I read them once, and if my memory doesn't keep them in, bad luck. But also, I encourage other people to read them so that they remember them better than me. And also, some of them are younger than me, so they can understand the legal technicalities. But my worry, all along, we can get the treaty, but it'll be just the government handballing the problems to us that they created. So I'm saying we need the support of the unions, we need the support of the ordinary carpenter, plumber, electrician, to try and put an Aboriginal person, Torres Strait Island person on, to help us grow our infrastructure needs. Nearly every money spent on housing for us, which is very limited, always ends up in non-Aboriginal hands. Any money spent on our cars always ends up in non-Aboriginal hands. We don't have the capacity that the rest of this population got used to from 1780s onward. We need to build the infrastructure. With that infrastructure must come land rights, because it needs us to be able to feed our own, us to be able to care for our own, us to be able to house our own, us to be able to educate our own. We all need that same right. Public housing, proper education, proper health. Aboriginal communities try, but we are failing thanks to government policies. So we need policies from our people that will work for us, and the infrastructure that will assist us in making those things work. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. And finally, can I ask Larry Foley?
Greetings, folks. My starting point is a quote from my brother out there somewhere, Robbie Thorpe. Australia is a crime scene, folks. And you don't resolve the crime by asking forgiveness from the criminal. I'm a pessimist. I've been around a long time. I no longer have faith in Australian society. I no longer believe that there is hope. I was very angry a little earlier here tonight when I realised that just before this function here tonight, I'm a professor of history, right? And I know a little bit about history. And it's a great pity that other people don't know as much about history as what I do. And I was a bit disappointed tonight when I heard that just before this function here downstairs, upstairs tonight, a criminal launched a book. A criminal who some of you may be familiar with. A criminal by the name of Jeff Kennett. See the reaction? Those of you who are old enough might recall that Jeff Kennett was responsible for the deaths of several Aboriginal children. When he closed down Northland Secondary College, which was one of the most important Aboriginal schools in this town, in this state, I said in the equal opportunity hearings that were held to try and resolve that dispute that unless that school was reopened fast, then some of the kids we were talking about whose educational opportunities had been destroyed by Jeff Kennett, some of those kids would die. Some of those kids did die. One of the children whose education was destroyed by Jeff Kennett was my son, who to this day, 30 years later, has never been able to have a job when his educational opportunities were destroyed by Jeff Kennett. Another thing about Jeff Kennett, you might recall when the Mabo decision was handed down by the High Court. Who was the Premier of Victoria at the time? And who was the Premier who said to people in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, this decision means that you can lose your backyard? What a lump of filth Jeff Kennett was and is. He launched a book upstairs tonight, a book that's on sale up there, folks. Don't buy that book. That made me angry. And in terms of constitutional recognition, what a farce, what a joke. Firstly and foremostly, because it's something that will not happen. The federal government's putting tens of millions, I think more than tens of millions of dollars into the campaign to try and convince you to vote for constitutional change. I was around in 1967 for the 1967 referendum. I worked on the arse end of the campaign for the 1967 referendum. I worked with some brilliant Aboriginal campaigners. Faith Bandler, one of the legends of the Aboriginal political movement. John Newfong, probably the greatest Aboriginal orator who has ever lived. And that includes the Cape York cane toad up in North Queensland, folks, right? You know, those of you who think that Noel Pearson is a great speaker and has got substance in the stuff that he says, you should have heard John Newfong speak, you know. John Newfong was a man of substance. And those people were involved in a campaign that took 10 years, that led into the 67 referendum. It was a tremendous result. In excess of 90% of the Australian people voted yes in that referendum. It's the biggest yes vote in the history of Australian referendums. It's one of the first yes votes since Federation, because the Australian people, the Australian people, have demonstrated over almost 200, since Federation, you've demonstrated a deep suspicion of politicians, which means that you rarely vote yes in a federal referendum. That's why the 67 referendum was one of the first you ever voted yes in. But those were different days. That vote got up because they were different days. Even Rupert Murdoch and his newspaper, The Australian, at that point in time, supported justice for Aboriginal people. That's no longer the case, folks. No longer the case. Since 67, we've had a person who's about to be resuscitated, a red-headed chip shop owner from Ipswich in Queensland. Pass me a drink of water, please. Called Pauline Hanson. And then we had a Prime Minister John Howard, who enthusiastically stole most of Pauline Hanson's ideas and policies and developed a really divisive state of Australia. We also had, in the last 15, 20 years, a thing called the History Wars, where Aboriginal people were unbelievably denigrated, vilified. So therefore, there's no chance in the Australia of today, even though this room's full of really good, compassionate, admirable people, you are a minority in Australia today. There is no way that any referendum question that involves Aboriginal issues or Aboriginal people or has to do with justice for Aboriginal people, there's no way that will get up in today's Australia in a referendum where the bar is set very, very high. So there's no chance of constitutional reform being achieved. So why is that issue dominant in the mainstream media? Even the ABC, that looks more and more like Murdoch media every day, you know, with so many Murdoch personalities infesting the airwaves of the ABC these days, there's no way it's going to get up. So why is it that the mainstream media is trying to tell all of you people that it is gonna? And rule number one, for if you're a cynic like me, rule number one is when you've got bipartisan support for an issue to do with Aboriginal people, you can bet your ass that that issue is not going to be of benefit to Aboriginal people. You know? The only people who benefit from an issue where you've got bipartisan support is white people. It makes white people feel good. These sort of issues are feel-good issues for white people. They're not anything that's going to do anything for Aboriginal people. And while we're talking about hypocrisy, let me remind you all, the incarceration rate of Aboriginal people in Australia today. It's a disgrace. You know, almost 30 years ago, we had a Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. You know, $50 million, 300 recommendations. The primary findings of that Royal Commission were the reason so many Aboriginal people were dying in the 80s in custody was because there were so many Aboriginal people in custody in the 80s. The primary recommendations of the Royal Commission were all about trying to prevent Aboriginal people from going to jail in the numbers that they were. Today we've got twice as many people, Aboriginal people, in jail as there were then, you know? And why? Because successive governments, in particular state governments, every time there's a state election anywhere in Australia, what's the first issue? Law and order, folks. Let's get tough. Let's get tough. You know, who are the people who go to jail as a result of those tough law and order issues? It's Aboriginal people and poor people, you know? Straight after the Royal Commission, a celebrated female politician, one of the first female premiers in Australia, in Western Australia, Carmen Lawrence, introduced into the Australian political scenario one of the more lunatic ideas from the United States of America. And I'm not talking about Donald Trump, I'm talking about mandatory sentencing. Mandatory sentencing, 3 strikes and you're out, a lunatic, stupid, idiotic idea from America. And what did the introduction of mandatory sentencing into Australia do? It put more Aboriginal people in jail than there's ever been. So, you know, let's, you know, forget about the hypocrisy, folks. And we're in the middle of a federal election right now. What a great thing, isn't it, folks? You know, Tweedledum and Tweedledee. Who are you going to pick? You know? What a joke. I ask you, the Australian people, even though there's a, you know, you represent a very minuscule, well, you represent nothing of the Australian people. You're at least here, you're prepared to listen, you came here to learn, you know, good, that's great. But when you leave here, go home and find yourself a racist and change their attitude. Hey, you won't have to look too far. A racist is easier to find in Australia, folks, you know? And if you can't find a racist, just go home. It's your own dining room. Raise the issue of Aboriginal affairs in your own living room, in your own, at your own kitchen table. You'll find your racist. And the challenge for you then is to attempt to change the attitude, or challenge and change the attitude of that racist who is either one of your personal friends or a member of your family. And once you start trying to do that, then you'll realise the enormity of the task in front of us if we are to change Australian society. In terms of treaty, in terms of self-determination, at the beginning of the 20th century, in the first part of the 20th century, in the first 15 years in the 1900s, the earliest Aboriginal political, modern-day Aboriginal political organisation that emerged was an organisation called the Australian Aborigines Progressive Association. It was based on the ideas of the father of international black nationalism, Marcus Garvey. You didn't know that. You think that Aboriginal people are, simplistic and, have got no real political understanding. The first, yes? No, I'm going to keep going. Now, the basic premise on the first modern Aboriginal political organisation had to do with political and economic independence. That's what's needed for Aboriginal Australia. For Aboriginal people to regain what we lost with the invasion, to regain, to re-empower ourselves. The only way you're going to do that is through, firstly, economic independence, which leads to political independence. And if necessary, I reckon it's important that Aboriginal peoples, some Aboriginal groups, should consider seceding from Australia. And why not? The Pitjantjatjara Nation have more people than the nation-state of Nauru. They've got a bigger homeland than the nation-state of Nauru. Why can't they be, and numerous other Aboriginal groups around Australia, become independent nations in their own right? Why do we have to be Australians? Forget treaty, forget nonsense of constitutional reform. Think seriously about giving Aboriginal people genuine control over their own destinies again. Otherwise, in 50 years' time, folks, there will be no Aboriginal people. If Noel Pearson has his way and all of these new assimilationists have their way, in 50 years' time, the assimilation project will be complete. The genocide will be complete. There will be no Aboriginal people, and you can all be happy. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Victor. I'm a teacher at RMIT University, and I'm originally from the Basque Country. So for anyone who is not familiarized, it's an area between Spain and France who has been claiming independence from the state of Spain for some time. And I have to say I'm surprised that more opinions like Dr. Foley's are not commented in public more often, because so Serene has mentioned 4 options for Aboriginal political representation that seem to fit within the Australian Constitution. But what about not fitting within the Australian Constitution? What about independence? What about maybe international supervision of a secession process of at least maybe some nations in some areas of Australia? I wonder how popular this idea is in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders political circles. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe I'll take one more question. Being very indecisive here. Do you want to ask a question as well? You'd like that to be answered. Okay, I was hesitating about that as well. Okay, can I ask our panel whether anybody on the panel would like specifically to take responsibility to answer that question? Gary.
It's always been talked about, independent states. And Michael Mansell actually wrote a paper on the 7th state. And there's a paper up on the website if you'd like to look at it. And he sort of argued the case that sovereignty is a state of mind. I'm sovereign right now, in my mind, in my heart, and the way I am. Right? I'm not going to break your laws. I'll take your foreign aid. I'll go on Centrelink, get through uni, but that's foreign aid to me. To talk about a physical separate state is difficult because there are 260 First Nations across this state. And let's say, for argument's sake, the theory is we all move to Arnhem Land. Get out of the southern states, go to Arnhem Land. Would that work? Probably not, because I'm leaving my country, I'm not leaving my country for nobody. I want to exert my rights in my country, on my country, wherever I am. But I don't particularly want to go to Arnhem. Independence, well, you know, independence can be done a whole heap of ways. We could have an elected treaty commission with commissioners from every clan who meet regularly to talk about the strategies and address the issues that Larry was raising. A treaty addresses everything. Everything's on the table. And we've got to start talking about what is that exactly and how it's going to work practically. We don't want a theoretical, hypothetical treaty. We want outcomes. We want to address closing the gap. We want to address 15,000 of our kids are out of home care. 1,500 in Victoria. That is a disgrace on the part of the state, and our own organisations too should be ashamed of themselves. I don't pull punches on them either. They need to get their gear together. They need to start performing better. And a treaty addresses that too. We don't leave our own out on this. If they're the problem and not the solution, we go after them too in a treaty, as we do government. And we need to address all those issues. And I think a treaty is like a book. It's got chapters in it. And a chapter can talk about sovereignty, it can talk about constitutional reform, it can talk about racist legislation, it can talk about reparations, ongoing compensation, it can talk about all those sort of things. It can talk about incarceration rates and how we're going to fix that. It will fix up the gaps and create new initiatives. I'm not a pessimist. I think there's a little bit of hope there and there's a door opening every day. Thank you.
Larry?
For me, I am an independent person. I don't pay tax, and every time the government threatens me, I tell them it's a threat and I don't like it and I'm still not paying. I don't go and collect any benefits because I don't believe I should get paid by someone I disagree with. I am independent and it's a bloody struggle if I haven't got the infrastructure. So again, independence relies on having the right infrastructure around you. The things Gary was talking about getting in place, all of those things. There's plenty of people who can testify that they're not sure where I live exactly. There's plenty of people who can testify that I don't care if I argue with government because I ain't paying, whether it be a fine, whether it be a tax bill, because it ain't my government. Independence comes at a price. If there was enough of us, if the infrastructure was there, I'd go, yeah, let's go for independence. But in my country, and also with the way native bloody title works, I'd end up with nothing anyway. So I might as well stay independent. And it's because we don't have a proper thing where we can support each other, a proper mechanism. We did, but thanks to Eurocentric interference, we don't anymore. Those organisations that we feel are no longer part of us, that they used to be once, because some of us worked in them, some of us helped build them, and now they're too Eurocentric, so we don't like using them. I have friends that other people know and walk around, but nobody knows where they live or whatever they are, because if you're a Stolen Generations, you've had your records since you're 18, and I have one of 500 pages with at least another 100 or 200 missing. So I don't like being on government books. I don't like going to organisations and getting my name on their books, because that goes to the government. And I'm sorry, there is a high percentage of us, which is some of the homeless too, who because of our backgrounds refuse to trust. So we'd rather be poor and independent than be part of the system that actually stole us from our families treated us terribly and kept writing reports on us about us being primitive when they were the ones not teaching us anything but making us feel bad about each other. No, independence if we had the resources. This country, we will not have the resources until we can negotiate them through a treaty. We've got no choice but to look at how we can make our kids' futures, our grandkids' futures, and even, heck, I intend to live to be 90, my future. So that I'm not going to keep hidden all the time.
Thanks, Larry. Yeah.
Hi, I'd like to pay my respects to past, present and future generations and respect the land that I stand on today. I am a direct descendant from a stolen gem. My father has gone back to country, Wamba Wamba. He was born there on the blackfellas camp on the other side of the Edwards River. 2 days ago, it's taken me 57 years to get a piece of paper to know where my grandmother is buried. I have a son that is having his 4th child. So self-determination is an extremely important thing to me that will reflect on everyone in the room. Because I know that one day I'd like my grandson to say to his children, "Grandfather, what was racism like?" So yeah, I find it personally myself deeply offended when I have to listen to a lot of jargon in politics and sympathy votes for people's opinions of what it was like. Well, I stand here today, direct descendant from the inadequacies of the system that has continued to fail us. Well, I think it's about time we all go forward, eh? Self-determination. Thank you. Thank you, uncles. Thank you, Art.
Thank you. Okay. There's a questioner here, and then there's one at the back of the room.
A question for the two women. You both seem... My name is Morris Alexander, by the way. You both seem to tell us something which I thought was quite interesting about this situation. And in particular, I'd address myself to Sharon as a lawyer, because I too am a lawyer, as is Cheryl. And the idea that you were putting forward, which I think sort of fits in with the idea that Margaret Gardner was putting forward, is that there's a point in which we're talking about people who are not at odds with each other over a long period of time. We're in fact talking about a population of Australia which has amongst it, to its great benefit, people who are descended from a culture that's much older than the European culture that most of us are descended for. And I like your idea, Sharon, and in some ways the idea of local government being involved. So do you think those two ideas, perhaps you could expand a bit more on those two ideas, and you in particular, Sharon, as a lawyer, how we might work together to get these sort of things happening?
Okay, well, can you hold that thought while I just ask the gentleman up the back who's had his hand up for a while.
Thank you. My name is Shivam Ganguly, and just before I ask my question, I would like to respond to Victor. He spoke about division or dividing a country. I originally come from India, and we know a thing or two about division. And I don't want to wish anybody the disparity and and the despair of dividing a country. So in saying that, my question to the panel is, there's a lot of themes today being spoken about recognition, treaty and sovereignty, but we are here for facts and ambitions as well. The fact remains that Aboriginal people in Australia makes up about 3% of the population. They're not represented in the legislative houses, whether in federal government or in the state governments. Even if we have a treaty, these legislative houses will still be making laws which will be in the areas of education, health, and local government, land rights, and all of those things. It's unfortunate that Dr. Foley said, don't read the book that's been published by Shireen and her colleagues. I've read the book. And it talks about how representation from the communities of Aborigines.
Okay, please let him ask his question. If you could put your question quite soon, sir.
So my question is, if we have a representation or a representative body within the Constitution, wouldn't that advantage the non-representative state of Indigenous people at the moment, because you're not reflected in this legislature? Thank you.
Thank you. Auntie Margaret, do you want to say anything first?
Yes, quite happy to say. I'm a supporter of the decisions being made at a more direct level. I and my people, the Wurundjeri people, would not be terribly interested in morphing into anything that a national body might want to give us some guidance about. Because a national body is simply going to be an advisory body unless things really change with attitude here. And I'm talking about, in Parliament houses around the nation and in Canberra. The Westminster system is not going to allow us to have any real recognition. It's not really going to give us any self-determination. It's not going to give us anything where we can aspire to having a future that is at the same level, so equable to everyone else in the country. I have to say, I'm not unsupportive of refugees. I have done many welcomes to country for refugee people. I go and support them at events where I can, and I do things at a local level out in Dandenong, that's where I live. But they're getting more support on arrival than we get. And I'm not talking about all the Closing the Gap money. I'm not talking about all the money that goes into Aboriginal childcare in this state so that the kids should be still at home with their parents, because there should be preventative programs out there. And I suppose I'm reflecting a bit on what Larry was saying, infrastructure stuff. There's all kinds of issues that we have to resolve amongst ourselves. The treaty situation is going to bring all those to the surface. We can start sorting out our own sewerage, for want of a better word. It's serious. The reason for the homeless is that, and I'm not one of those people who's even racist with Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people. I might be accused of that at times, but it's only because I'm so passionate about what my own mob don't have. We need to have equity in housing. You shouldn't be waiting up to 10, 12 years for an Aboriginal house from the Aboriginal Housing Board statewide body. You shouldn't be waiting for weeks for your maintenance. I've been waiting 6 weeks now for a new handle on the back security door, all because the spring's gone, because somebody didn't bother putting repair and or replace on the order, the purchase order. So I have to wait. That means I've got flies and mozzies coming in. That was in summer. Now it's, mice, because it's been raining so much. Every mouse in Dandenong seems to come to my place. So things. And yes, I'm in Aboriginal housing. I haven't ever had enough money to buy my own house. I don't necessarily want to be indebted to one of the four big banks out there for 30 years or more to pay off a house that I think I should be entitled to anyway. Because I don't have a place where I can go to build a house. I have to buy my own land to build a house. That just doesn't sit right with me. Now, I'm not a totally selfish person. Yes, I'm on Centrelink. I don't owe any tax. I haven't put in a tax return for years because I prefer to do things on Centrelink. But then this here, what I'm doing tonight, to me, is contributing back into the whole of the Australian community. And that's how most of the people who can become a bit vocal, who are not necessarily highly educated but reasonably educated, who have had enough life experience over the years, enough experience in trying to assist and help their own people at a local community control level, who have not just earned the right to have a voice, but actually have something to say that's sensible and rational. There's plenty of us out there, and together we can start looking at ways of reparation amongst ourselves, and also then reparation with the wider community for all the past wrongs and mistakes, etc., etc. Now, there's a whole raft of things that we can look at. There's particular ways we could fix it. I don't see it happening through a national representative body. We've got a group out there called NATCHO, it's the National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation. I still don't know one thing they've done for anybody in Victoria.
Thanks, Margaret.
That's just one example. National education body, well, big deal. We've got Woiwurrung being taught in 2 schools in Melbourne. Only once did they really come and make an issue of talking to us about whether it was okay. One of those schools we have a Wurundjeri person delivering it. The other school we don't. These are the things that are happening. We don't mind sharing. Gosh, we've been doing it since 1836. Now, it's time for us to start thinking about what we need to have a future that's on par with everybody else. And that's the way we're going to go. National stuff, I'm afraid, doesn't belong down here. If there was a national push to get us all up out of the misery that we've been in, I think it would have happened by now. So Victoria's leading the way, and that's how it's going to stay as far as I'm concerned.
Thanks. Shireen and then Gary. Shireen?
I'll answer the first question first. How are we going to make it work, I think, was the gist of your... And it's true, whether we're talking about agreements at the local government level, agreements at the state level, or whether we're talking about agreements at the very national level, which is really what we're talking about when we're discussing constitutional reform. You know, the Constitution itself is a compact. It's a power-sharing compact, just like a treaty is a power-sharing agreement. And some constitutional scholars actually call the Constitution a treaty. So I think we need to do the hard work in building consensus, whether we're talking about agreement or whether we're talking about constitutional reform. And that means working together across political and ideological divides and seeing the common ground that exists. But to do that, it means we all, as Australians, need to rise above our petty rivalries and personal differences, to see that common ground and to work together to build the consensus. And building consensus also means that you sometimes have to talk to and persuade unpopular and sometimes unsavoury characters on both the left and the right. On both the left and the right. You have to. You have to. You know, you have to talk to the people on the right, you have to talk to the people on the left, and you have to build a reform package, agreements, representation, culture and language recognition that everybody can agree on. And just responding to the gentleman at the back, you made a comment about if there's a treaty, laws and that kind of thing will still happen. And I think that's a really good point that advocates need to consider in a smart way. What do you put in the agreements? What do you put in legislation, knowing that legislation, as Gary said, I think, can be chucked out by a future parliament, so you might lose what you gained? And what is the most important thing that you want to put in the Constitution where it has the strength and stability and endurance of an intergenerational guarantee, right? That is why you try to put things in the Constitution, because it's the most enforceable and stable place to make a promise. That the Constitution is the only thing that legally curtails the power of Parliament. So if you want to compel Parliament to do something, in a practical legal sense, you actually have to put it in the Constitution. So thinking really holistically about this problem before us, I think that's the thing. What is the package? Are we going to seek representation? Are we going to seek ongoing agreement making? Are we going to seek recognition of First Nations? What does it look like? What goes in legislation? What goes in local government agreements? What goes in the Constitution, where it will be, hopefully for all time, until another referendum happens, as I think Gary pointed out, there is that possibility. But that would be my answer to those two questions.
Now, we're out of time. So I'm going to... Gary wanted to come in on that question. I give him the last go, and then I'm going to have to wrap up with regrets.
Have the last word, eh?
Try to.
A couple of points, I suppose. In my treaty book, there's chapters, as I've said. There is a chapter on dedicated seats in Parliament. State Parliament and Commonwealth Parliament and local government. You've got to be in there at the seat of power where they're making decisions and they're doing the regulations and they're doing the legislation and all that. That's all I'll say about that. And obviously the treaty contains reparations and future funds and how we're going to finance it and all that sort of stuff, and wonderful economic strategies and all the social issues we've got to pick up. But I've got to make a point about Australians are well known for walking and chewing gum and kicking a footy at the same time. And I say that because when I see the back of the head of a child blown off by a rocket or a high-powered rifle in Iraq or Syria, when I see a young kid drown, laying on the beach, and these are the images of war. We're a peaceful country. We can chew gum and walk. We should welcome those refugees, and it's not them and us. We help them. It's a big country. And we welcome those refugees. So yes, local government is important. The City of Melbourne runs a budget of about $400 to $600 million. The City of Moreland runs a budget of $130 million. The little country ones run a budget of about $22 million. I'd like to know by an audit, what dollars do they spend on black people that live in our local government areas? Where are their treaties with our people and our nations on that country? Wurundjeri is in a lucky position of having 25 local government councils. A powerful position can be done here. We don't just need the Commonwealth and the state. Local government is also the key to a treaty. And they need to step up to the plate just like Moreland has.
Thank you very much. Look, I'm always very reluctant to bring evenings like this to an end because there's never enough time for questions and we could go on all night. But our audience is melting away and I am also under instructions here. So can I just close the proceedings? First of all, by asking you to join with me in thanking our splendid panellists, Margaret Gardner, Shireen Morris, Gary Murray, Larry Walsh and Gary Foley.